Welcome once again to Tales from the Jar Side, the video series. Don't feel like reading my newsletter this week? That's fine. I'll read it to you, with extra stories and highlights and gags and whatever else occurs to me. So the title this week is Tales from the Jar Side, a 300 joke. A YouTube live stream? I make way too many mistakes, but at least I don't file legal briefs based on ChatGPT and the usual tweets and toots. The subtitle is The Rotation of the Earth Really Makes My Day. Welcome, fellow jarheads, to Tales from the Jar Side, the Cousin IT newsletter for the week of May 21st to 28th, 2023. Today's the 29th. This week I held a live stream on the Tales from the Jar Side YouTube channel. That was my first, which was fun, and recorded some other videos for a Spring and Spring Boot training course that's hosted on the O'Reilly Learning platform. Let's take our weekly look at the YouTube channel. Actually, before we do that, let's skip down to the first section. First section says a 300 joke. It says, this image says it all. And you can see there's a snapshot of the YouTube channel. And the part that's highlighted, if you can't see it, maybe make it a little bit bigger here, is that I hit exactly 300 subscribers, which meant it was time to make a 300 gag. So I went into Canva and made this one. This is YouTube from Tales from the Jar Side. Poor Leonidas. Yes, hopefully no viewers of my channel, jarheads as we say, will get massacred by an invading army of Persians, only to be bailed out at the Battle of Salamis a month later by the Athenian navy. I went down a rabbit hole this week digging into the Wikipedia articles on the Battle of Salamis and the Persian-Greek wars over the years and on and on. At any rate, it said as of this writing, I'm up to 306 subscribers. Let's see. Open in a new tab. And we have 308. Hey, there's something. How about that? So 308. Yeah, I know. It's going to be a long, long path. Okay, moving on. This week, I held my first ever YouTube live stream. And I did that with a bit of a mentor of mine, at least on the YouTube channel, Greg Turnquist. Now, Greg is the head of the Spring Data JPA project. I originally said he was the head of the Spring Data project, and he was quick to correct me. He didn't want the actual head of the Spring Data project to think he was usurping his authority or taking too much credit. And I'm like, it's not going to get mad at you. It's going to get mad at me. But at any rate, what happened was, if I go back to the YouTube channel, you'll see that now there's a live tab, and here is, in fact, the live stream. And we had a nice little time there. Now, I didn't know if anybody was going to show up. I did announce it a couple days early. Okay, I knew Bill Fly would show up. Hi, Bill. He's good about that. And he's retired. So, but I didn't know if anybody else would be there. As it turned out, we got, I don't know, several other people. I mean, the thing says it has 48 views, but we had enough people there that there were a lot of interesting questions and comments, and the conversation ranged over a wide range of topics. We had a lot of fun, or at least I had a lot of fun. I think Greg did as well. We talked about Spring, of course. We talked about JPA. We talked about the horrible Wildfly logo. I don't think I showed you that yet. Here's the logo for Wildfly. This is the former JBoss application server. I mean, look at that thing. It's a bug. They named their software after a bug. And they used a bug here. That's not something you want to use. That's something you want to swat. I admit it's gotten a little better over the years. It doesn't look quite as insect-like as it used to, but so be it. At any rate, we had a really good time on the live stream, and I hope to do another one soon. Not this week probably, but probably the week after. We'll do another one. Okay, moving on to our next section. This one's called I Hate It When I'm Wrong, but that doesn't keep it from happening. In fact, what happened this week is I encountered 3 problems during that development of that Spring course and other issues that caused me just hours and hours and even days of effort trying to resolve them. And 2 of them I know for sure, the ones I did resolve, turns out there were a couple of things that I thought I understood and I was wrong. I mean, it's not that I had it completely wrong, it's that I had an oversimplification in the understanding. Probably it's a trap from teaching these things, because when you teach things, you don't get into every little edge case or detail. You give them the basic idea and you move on, and then you revisit it and refine the understanding. I don't mean that as an excuse. I mean, it's probably the mechanism that led to my lack of getting it. Also, once you think you know something, you don't look at the docs anymore. Now, I don't want to go into great detail because I'm going to make separate videos on these, but let me give you an idea. I did make the comment, of course, my wife and I have this understanding that in our 30 plus years of marriage, she has yet to be wrong. You know, it's a rather extraordinary record, but I digress. So, in last week's newsletter, I mentioned that Spring Boot released version 3.1, and the changes weren't really dramatic, but one of the neat changes was this support for test containers. And I like the test containers project. I've been a big fan of it, I mean, from the beginning. Here's the test containers project. It's at testcontainers.org. They have implementations in a wide variety of languages. The only one I've used is Java. And if you take a look at the quick start, they talk about how to set up test containers. And I should at least explain what test containers is for. The idea of test containers is it's a way to add a capability to your project without installing anything locally. Because what it does is if there's something hosted in a Docker container, it will automate the download of the container and the startup and using it during your tests and then shutting it down automatically. So it's kind of like an API for Docker, a Java API in this particular case, but it's more sophisticated than that. And what I was trying to do is to say, okay, I want to demonstrate this. And not only that, I'm going to use a database that I don't even have installed locally. I'm going to use Postgres, as a matter of fact, which, I mean, I have many databases, but I don't have that one installed locally. And there's a module in here under databases that talks about Postgres here. And they just say, just add this implementation and you're good. Now, the spring release notes got into great detail about how Spring Boot has really updated its mechanism for this. See, there's the section on test containers in the Spring Boot 3.1 release notes, and how you could use them at development time, and you could do a boot test run, and you could do all this stuff, and it's really cool. And then I kept running into problems, and as I said, I'm going to make a video on this as it is, but let me show you what error I made, and then I'll come back to this. Well, I have been using this database where I was using an H2 database in my repository. Where's my build file? Here, I'll bring up the build file. And you can see in my build file, I've got the H2 database in memory, and then I was going to add Postgres. Now, the test containers support consists of this dependency here, plus the JUnit Jupyter extension for test containers to work with the annotations, and then their connection to Postgres. And that's really all I need in order to do everything. But what was happening was I was running my tests, and I kept getting errors saying that the product table, the table for the product class I was saving, wasn't found anywhere. And I couldn't understand why. And I went to the test containers Slack, and I asked my question there and got an immediate response by someone named, and I know I'm gonna mangle the pronunciation of his name, Edu Melendez. I assume it's Edu. I'm not sure exactly how the accent on the U changes the pronunciation there. But I talked to him about it, and you can see we actually went back and forth for like 30 different messages. It was amazing how much effort he spent on my little project. And what turned out to be the issue, the thing I did not understand, is that for H2, my embedded database, Hibernate defaults to create drop mode. In other words, every time I shut down, it drops the database, and every time I start up, it recreates it. And I was relying on this. I was actually taking advantage of it to generate the database schema. But that only is true for embedded mode. it turns out that if you're going to use a real database or anything that isn't embedded, then you have to go into your application.properties file and manually add the line to say, oh, DDL Auto is in either create drop or update mode or whatever that allows it to create the schema in the database. And I didn't realize that because I'd always thought it was already in create drop mode. And it was in embedded databases like H2, which I use when I teach this in class, but not in the rest. And Edu was kind enough to actually find the part of the documentation that highlighted this. Okay, so that was one. Database changes, which is what I'm really after. I was also trying to do some integration tests. And in my integration tests, when I test a controller, then I always make the test transactional, because one of the neat things in Spring is that when you run a Spring Boot test that's marked transactional, the tests roll back automatically and you don't wind up changing the database. And here's a little demo. If I go back to that project and I use the product repository test here, then see, here's a whole series of tests. It's going to count some products and find them by ID and find all, etc. And if I run this, let me take out the @transactional annotation here. So let me execute this. You can see here that I have a couple of errors down here in the lower part, because right here was the delete all products test, and that emptied the table of all the products. So when I tried to do a find by ID, there weren't any. None of them were there. And I tried to delete one that I thought existed, and it's not there either. So in other words, things were failing. So what I do, and this I've been doing for years, is make that test transactional and rerun it again. And what you'll see is that all the changes made to the database will roll back automatically, and now all the tests pass. So we're good. And I've been thinking that's how Spring worked for years. So then I went to run on my controller, my product controller tests. And when I ran those in transactional form, they started failing. And I'm like, why are they failing? And what I quickly realized was that, in fact, what was happening is that the database changes weren't getting rolled back. I'm like, why aren't they getting rolled back? And that's when I found, as I point out in the blog post here, there's a section in the Spring Boot documentation that says, if your test is transactional, it rolls back at the end of each test by default. Great, each test method. However, as using this arrangement with either random port, which is what I was doing, I was running a test server, or define port implicitly provides a real servlet environment, the HTTP client and server run in separate threads, and thus in separate transactions. Any transaction initiated on the server does not roll back in this case. And I'm like, what? I had no idea. I mean, it's written there as this big note, like you're supposed to notice, okay? And I didn't notice. And I'm like, I've been doing this for years. What's the problem? Well, let me show you what the problem is. Here's my old teaching app, the one that I ran for years. And here's my product REST controller test right here, which is going to run on Spring Boot test on a random port. And I've marked it transactional. And let me run this and you'll see all the tests pass. Everything looks great, right? You think it's all good. And here's the thing. You see these tests? You see the order down here? Here's an insert, which is going to modify the database. I now know. But I didn't do anything after that counted the number of products, so I didn't even notice a product had been added. Here I'm getting a single product that does not exist. I'm actually checking an error condition. Then I do delete all, which empties the table. Again, removed everything from the database. But the next thing I try to do is delete a single product, and there weren't any IDs found. I didn't even notice. And then finally I did an insert again. In other words, the order of the test bailed me out. None of the tests that happened after modifying the database were going to make any of my other tests fail. it was a coincidence. It was the fact that they happened to run in the right order, because one of my favorite mechanisms in one of my favorite sets of documentation is the JUnit documentation. And in JUnit, they actually say over here that by default, test classes and methods will be ordered using an algorithm that is, and here it is, deterministic, but intentionally non-obvious. I just can't say that without laughing. Deterministic meaning it's the same every time, but intentionally non-obvious meaning we're not going to tell you what that order is because we don't want you to rely on it. So, okay, how do I prove that I have an error? Well, I used a different annotation from JUnit 5, this one, test method order, which said, okay, let's order our test by the name of the test method, just to demonstrate it. And now let me run them in a different order than the one I was getting. And now look, half of them are failing because the delete happened first, alphabetically. And down we go. And I had no idea because I hadn't done it this way for years. Now, as it turns out, there's a fix. What I have to do in my new app, the one that I'm using from now on, is that in the product controller test, I don't run on a running server. I use a mock server. I do mock MVC, which is a mock environment, and that means that now the transactions roll back, and also I can still auto-wire in a web test client, and all the rest of my tests now pass again. Everything's good. But it took me a long time to work this out. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of effort. And as I say, I'm going to make some videos about this. But wow, it was a long week. Okay, so that's the second one. The third problem that happened had to do with the big addition to Spring when Spring 3.0 came out, which was the addition of the GraalVM native image compiler. The idea that you could take your output and use a native compiler to compile it down to executable code on that platform. And then the startup time would be almost nothing. I mean, it would just be incredibly fast. Now, there's a big debate as to whether this is a good idea or not. I mean, it does kind of violate Java's whole premise of write once, run anywhere. You know, you're now making machine language code for a particular platform. Also, what's so wonderful about startup time anyway? I mean, if you're building a RESTful web service, then you don't care that it took a couple extra seconds to start. You care how quickly it responds to requests. And that doesn't change. It still responds to requests with the same speed it responded before, and that's fine. It starts up a lot faster. So at any rate, I wanted to do a demo, and I did it on my new app, and everything compiled. The native compiler took like 2.5, 3 minutes to run, so I'm not going to demonstrate it now. But then when I tried to execute it, I keep getting this exception, which I didn't include in here, but it's a missing constructor exception in some weird class that's embedded in the middle of Hibernate. And I have no idea why. Now, in that particular case, I was able to go to a different app and run the native compiler and then run the native run, and it worked. So, and that one had Hibernate in it too. So I have no idea what's going on in that one. But at least I was able to complete the course. But this one, I don't know what to do about, and I'm hoping I'll resolve that in the near future. So as I said, 2 out of 3 ain't too bad. Oh, and there's the Nut Bunnies reference, the one to Freakazoid, which we've been using ever since my son was a little kid and watched Freakazoid. At any rate, there's the Meatloaf song, and now let's move on. So there was my learning experience this week, and 2 of them I resolved. The third one is in process. We'll see. I'll let you know when I figure it out. Let's move on to our next section. This was a riot. I couldn't believe it. This one was about a lawyer who used ChatGPT to come up with relevant cases for a court case, relevant precedents, I should say, and it made them up. And the lawyer didn't realize that, but worse, then they kind of doubled down on it, even when they got caught. So there's a New York Times article in here, and I did use my gift article to put it in here. So if you feel like you want to read it, that's fine. But it's not really as thorough as the the actual tweet thread that showed all the details. See, this says a lawyer representing a man who sued an airline relied on artificial intelligence to prepare a court filing. It did not go well. And of course, I have to put in the Princess Bride. Let me explain. No, there's too much. Let me sum up. So I go through the details here, and you're welcome to read it. But what I really recommend reading is this Mastodon thread. Let me open that in another tab here, by someone named Kendra Albert. And here it is. It says, are you just checking up on the bonkers story about the lawyer using ChatGPT for federal court filings? This is the thread for you. And she goes through the details. She's a lawyer herself, by the way, although not related to this particular case, and discusses how they came up and cited all these cases that were incredibly relevant. I mean, it was just perfect to be perfectly relevant to what they were doing. And that should have been a red flag right there. I mean, you never get that lucky that something is exactly what you want like that. I mean, we wouldn't have made it to court in the first place. It was that obvious. But they filed the affidavit. They cited all these cases. The other team of lawyers, the airline's lawyers, went and looked for those cases and couldn't find them, and then said to the judge, hey, we can't find them either. And the judge went, okay, let me look for them. And he couldn't find them either. So he told the team, you got to produce these cases. And again, she's pointing this out. The case was basically perfect, tailor-made for their case. And there were some other weird ones. There are parts in quotes. There's some 11th Circuit ruling as if they'd made it, and all this. In other words, there were enough red flags that the legal team should have recognized this. But then they doubled down and said, no, I believe this guy. It should be fine. Everything's good. And there was like a week delay and everything. And it turned out they finally had to admit it, that 6 of the submitted cases were hallucinated by ChatGPT, that the lawyer who had looked for citations had used the ChatGPT client. And of course, ChatGPT will give you what you ask for. It will try very hard. And its relevance to reality is kind of immaterial and all that. So the judge is really mad. And then they say that there's a hearing set for June 8th, bring your popcorn, and the lawyers are going to get sanctioned, and the law firm and everything. It was quite an adventure. So at any rate, feel free to take a look at the Mastodon toot thread, I suppose I should say, the post there, to see how that came out. Okay, let's move on to this week's Tweets and Toots. The first one here, this is the Tweets and Toots section. Actually, I want to point out, by the way, all of these came from Mastodon this week. That's a first for me. I just didn't collect very many on Twitter, partly because I'm trying to scale back what I do on Twitter anyway, and partly because I just didn't see that many really funny things. Anyway, this one says, me, have you tried turning it off and then bacon? Them, you mean back on? Me, I said what I said. Yeah, it might work. If not, at least you have bacon, right? This one says, one snowman says to the other, can you smell carrots? And of course, I'm never going to be able to look at snowmen without wondering about that from now on. So that was very good. Here was another one about using AI, and this one has to do with security. So what makes you human? Either to love and care for others, or selecting all the images with traffic lights. Yeah, exactly. You know that's something that they've got to find easy to automate. Anyway. In this toot, I pointed out, if you're like me, you're going to read it twice, one to figure out what they're saying, and then the second time in rhythm. So I'll just jump to the punchline. The last line is on The Muppet Show Tonight. So the way you have to read this is, it's time to kill the old world. It's time to birth the new. It is a time of monsters on The Muppet Show Tonight. Bum, 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 bum. And go on. And it's like, it scans perfectly. I don't even care what they're saying here, to be honest, but it was funny. On another one, this was part of a toot. I took the image out because I don't think the author, the person who posted it, made it or anything. I think it was just referenced somewhere, and I don't have the original reference. It said, others make mistakes too, and people make mistakes. That's why pencils have erasers. That's the cliche, and why Cindy has gonorrhea. Yeah, that's some mistake, right? My goodness. At least my mistakes this week didn't involve any communicable diseases, at least as far as you know. Maybe as far as I know as well. I like this one too. Somebody posted, what am I, chopped liver? And they gave it the caption, that's chopped liver becoming self-aware on our path on the way to generalized AI, right? Does it use ChatGPT to get that? Now, I did another somewhat interesting thing. I was trying to make some comments about those Spring Boot transactional tests not really rolling back the changes to the database, which I discussed in the earlier section of the newsletter. And again, look for a video about that within a week. You know, it's on its way. I asked ChatGPT for titles for that video and even hooks, stuff like that. And it gave me a whole bunch. Of course it did. And they were okay. Some were good, some were not so good. What I did is I made a YouTube poll and I made a LinkedIn poll. Here's the LinkedIn poll. I think I have that linked here. And that one actually got some attention. That looks like as of right now, that's got 20 votes on it. What title should I use for the Spring Boot transactional test video? And I had to abbreviate this because apparently LinkedIn limits you to only 30 characters in the titles. So I don't know if I like any of these as they stand. Transactional Spring Boot testing traps got a couple of votes, and Spring Test DB surprise, and then the one that got the most was Spring Test rollbacks gotchas. It's like, okay, I'm thinking about it. But the best part about this, unquestionably, was the comment provided by Dan Hinojosa, who said, roll back to where you once belong. Get back, Loretta. Yes, absolutely. Roll back to where you once belong. I love it. I'm just not sure that that's going to make a click-worthy title on the video. But boy, that was wonderful. I tried to do the same thing on the YouTube channel because I've never done a community post before, and you used to have a certain minimum number of subscribers to do community posts, and now you don't. So I went into the community section and I put in my little post here. I need a title for this one. They don't limit the length of the titles the same way. They don't even limit the length of the question the same way. But I only got 5 votes, and I think one of them was me because I couldn't see the results unless I clicked on one of these. So transactional traps and Spring Boot testing. I mean, really boring, but okay. So, hey, let's hope engagement is a good thing. I don't know. We'll see how that works out. So that's in this section on the Tweets and Toots, even though it's not a tweet or a toot. Moving on, there was a neat little post called Calc versus Loanword. It says, English has 2 different terms for words that come into English from other languages. A calc is translated from the source language, like flea market, beer garden. Beer garden sounds almost the same in German. Paper tiger. A loan word is ported in its original form, as in cafe, bazaar, kindergarten. Perhaps ironically, the word calc is a loan word, while loan word is a calc. From the Deutsch Lehnwort. Yeah. I don't know what to make of that. I just thought it was really interesting. I'd never heard either term, to be honest. This was another post. Dan Hinojosa was active this week. He put up this little toot here, Artificial Intelligence Steampunk Captain Picard. I don't know if he generated it using Midjourney or he got it from somebody else who did, but look at that. I mean, that's Jean-Luc Picard is as a steampunk captain. And yeah, okay, I'd follow him. Yeah, no doubt. Is he a pirate, a line officer, or a privateer? Those were the pirates that were sponsored by the government. I think he's a pirate. I mean, to fit in that costume, of course, he had to make it so. And here was the final one. Doc Brown was always kind of creepy. That relationship with Marty didn't bear close scrutiny. It was a little weird. I know I'm old, but some of you may need a reminder. And it says, want to feel old? If Back to the Future came out today, Doc Brown and Marty McFly would go back to 1993. The end of the first Bush administration, and that's when Bill Clinton took office. He was elected in 92 when George Bush Sr. Had his administration end. Now, of course, I couldn't help pointing out Doc Brown didn't go back in time with Marty. He met the Doc Brown from 1955, even though Marty was the time traveler. But I get it. The 1955, and I remember, of course, speaking of presidents, Marty says, or rather, Doc Brown says to Marty, "Who's president in 1985?" And he says, "Ronald Reagan." He says, "What, the actor?" And Jane Wyman's, is first lady, and who's Jack Benny, Secretary of the Treasury, all that. It was all a gag. Now you'd go back to 1993 and say, "Who's the president?" And you'd say, Joe Biden. And it's like he was already running back then. I think the first time he ran was 88, as a matter of fact. And he didn't do very well, but he was a young guy and he didn't want to miss time with his family. So he wasn't all that engaged in the whole thing. So isn't that ironic? Now, you wouldn't want to mention the previous president. That would get people's attention. Well, have a great week, everybody. So as a reminder, you can see all my upcoming training courses on the O'Reilly Learning Platform at the link provided, and all the No Fluff Just Stuff virtual workshops here. This coming week, I'm doing the Functional Programming in Java course in the APAC time zones, and I'm also doing week 1 of my Spring and Spring Boot in 3 weeks course on the O'Reilly Learning Platform, and I think I am going to have to upgrade to Spring Boot 3. I've been normally teaching that class with the GitHub repository in 2, but the exercises in 3, so that people could see both. But it may be time to just make the transition up to Spring Boot 3. See, the real challenge in that is that requires everybody who wants to do the exercises to have Java 17. And that's still asking a lot. But the transition is going on. The industry is moving that way. So look for a couple of videos from me this week on those 2 topics I discussed. And thank you very much for your attention. And I'll see you all next week. Take care.